Coca-Cola sold, at the peak of World War II, more than 5 billion bottles to American soldiers using public money and machinery built by the United States Army. That wasn't philanthropy. It was the largest geographic expansion operation in corporate history, and the American taxpayer footed the bill. A morphine-addicted pharmacist created a drug in Atlanta in 1886. That drug became the most consumed beverage on the planet. Along the way, the company that carried it bought legislators, reformulated its chemistry to escape regulators, used a world war as a distribution tool, and left behind a system so deeply integrated into the global economy that no government has been able to dismantle it. What nobody asks is why the formula changed in 1901, and why the company spent decades denying that the change ever happened. If this kind of story interests you, subscribe and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, did you know Coca-Cola was once sold as medicine? John Stith Pemberton survived the American Civil War with a saber wound to the chest and a morphine addiction that had no known cure. It was 1865, and the South was destroyed. Pemberton was a pharmacist in Columbus, Georgia, and spent the following years searching for a chemical substitute for the opioid that controlled his life. In that process, he found cocaine. For the medicine of the time, this was no scandal. Sigmund Freud was publishing papers praising cocaine as a treatment for depression and impotence. Tonic manufacturers across Europe and the United States were adding coca extracts to their formulations. It was considered a safe, modern, scientific drug. Pemberton fit perfectly into that context, a physician experimenting with legal substances in search of therapeutic utility. In 1885, after Atlanta passed a temperance law banning alcohol, he adapted his formula and created a soft drink instead of a medicated wine. He combined South American coca leaf with West African cola nut, two sources of powerful stimulants. The coca leaf released cocaine, which produced an immediate dopamine surge. The cola nut supplied caffeine, which sustained the effect over time. The result was pharmacologically efficient, a drink that first elevated and then maintained a state of alertness. Pemberton called it a brain tonic and sold it as a treatment for nervousness, headaches, and fatigue. The first sales took place at Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta on May 8, 1886, at 5 cents a glass. The cocaine dose per glass was approximately 9 milligrams, well below the 50 to 75 milligrams in a typical line, but biologically active enough to create the effect consumers associated with the drink. Pemberton prescribed 5 ounces of coca leaf per gallon of syrup. It was a deliberate dose, not an accidental one. Pemberton's problem was that he was a scientist, not a businessman. He sold portions of the formula to different partners while still alive, fragmenting the rights. When he died in 1888, practically insolvent, Asa Griggs Candler bought full control for $2,300, the equivalent of $73,000 in today's money. It was the cheapest deal in American business history, and Candler knew it. Candler was the opposite of Pemberton. He had no interest in medicine. He had interest in markets. In the early years, Candler's strategy was simple: aggressive syrup distribution to pharmacies with soda fountains, which mixed the concentrate with carbonated water on the spot. He offered the syrup at subsidized prices to new establishments, creating sales points before demand existed. Sales jumped from roughly 9,000 gallons in 1890 to over 370,000 gallons in 1900. The formula was the same. The cocaine was there. What changed in 1901 was not the drink's chemistry. It was the demographics of its consumers. While Coca-Cola was sold exclusively at soda fountains to white middle-class customers, the cocaine in the product was tolerated as a sophisticated medicinal ingredient. Nobody questioned a nerve tonic aimed at white businessmen who needed focus. But in 1899, when Candler expanded into national bottling, the drink reached anyone with a nickel, including black workers in the South. What followed was a documented and deliberate moral panic. Southern newspapers published articles linking cocaine to criminal behavior among black men. The New York Medical Journal published a piece in 1902 claiming that cocaine created a specific black menace, arguing that the drug made black men violent and dangerous to white women. There was no evidence for that claim. It was racism dressed in scientific vocabulary. The Atlanta Constitution, the newspaper of the city where Coca-Cola was manufactured, published in 1901 that soft drinks containing cocaine could lead black men to unconsciously cultivate an addiction. The political pressure reached Candler directly. In 1901, he ordered a formula reformulation, reducing the coca extract and increasing sugar and caffeine. And he began publicly denying that the drink had ever contained cocaine. That denial is on the record. Candler lied. There was no pharmacological ambiguity. Pemberton had explicitly described the product's composition in his records. Cocaine was in the original formula, and Candler knew it because he had purchased those records along with the brand. The removal was gradual. Through 1903, Coca-Cola still contained residual amounts of fresh coca extract. After 1904, the company began using spent leaves, the byproduct of the industrial cocaine extraction process carried out by pharmaceutical companies, which still contained traces of the substance. Only in 1929 did the formula become completely free of the alkaloid. But here's the detail that transforms the story. The company didn't simply stop using coca leaves. It kept using them to this day, just without the cocaine. And to do that, it needed a unique federal license, because the importation of coca leaves has been controlled by the DEA since the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914. The practical result was a pharmaceutical monopoly inside a beverage company. The Stepan Company in Maywood, New Jersey, which absorbed Maywood Chemical Works in 1959, remains to this day the only facility in the United States authorized by the DEA to import coca leaves. It imports roughly 100 metric tons per year, primarily from Peru and Bolivia. It extracts the cocaine for pharmaceutical use, and it supplies the decocainized residue to Coca-Cola as a flavoring agent, referred to internally as merchandise number 5. No competitor can replicate that ingredient. It's a barrier to entry created by federal law, protected by decades of lobbying, and invisible to the consumer. But the formula was only one part of the system. Coca-Cola's greatest innovation wasn't chemical, it was logistical. In 1899, two attorneys from Chattanooga, Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead, convinced Candler to hand over the bottling rights for the entire United States for $1. A single dollar. Candler signed because he was convinced that the drink's future was in soda fountains, that industrial bottling was expensive and risky, and that hauling heavy glass bottles would destroy the profit margin. He was wrong in a way that no other businessman has ever been wrong at that scale. Thomas and Whitehead didn't build a central factory. They created a sub-franchise system, selling bottling territories to local partners across the country. Coca-Cola shipped only the concentrated syrup. The local bottlers supplied the water, the carbonation, the bottles, and the distribution. The parent company in Atlanta became an intellectual property bank. It owned the formula and the brand, but carried none of the capital risk of the factories. That model had one fundamental technical advantage: weight. Water is heavy. Transporting finished beverage from a central factory to the entire American territory was logistically impossible in the early 20th century. By shipping only the concentrate and letting local bottlers add the water, Coca-Cola eliminated 90% of the weight to be transported. It was supply chain efficiency before the concept existed. To protect the system against counterfeiting, which was immediate and aggressive, the company commissioned in 1915 the development of a bottle that was impossible to copy. The brief given to the engineers was precise. The bottle needed to be recognizable in the dark by touch alone, and identifiable from the shards on the ground. It wasn't design, it was anti-counterfeiting engineering. The contour bottle's concave shape and texture were deliberately difficult to reproduce in artisan glassworks, creating a physical barrier to entry for counterfeiters. Around 1910, the federal government tried to challenge the system from another angle. In the case United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola, initiated in 1911, the government attempted to force the company to remove caffeine from the formula, arguing it was a harmful ingredient. Coca-Cola won at the trial level, lost at the Supreme Court in 1916, and eventually reduced its caffeine content. But the precedent had been set. The company was large enough to contest federal regulation and walk away with a partial victory. What nobody anticipated was the use the company would make of a war. In December 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Robert Woodruff, president of Coca-Cola, issued an internal communication that became famous in the corporate archives. Every American soldier in uniform should have access to a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he was, and whatever the cost to the company. It was a generous declaration. It was also a surgical lobbying maneuver. Woodruff convinced the American government that Coca-Cola was essential to troop morale, and therefore should be exempt from the sugar rationing imposed during the war. At a moment when sugar was being rationed for civilians and most food companies were fighting for minimum quotas, Coca-Cola received virtually unlimited sugar because it had convinced the Department of Defense that it was a military necessity. With that exemption secured, the company deployed to the battlefield industrial engineers holding patents as Army colonels, referred to internally as Coca-Cola colonels. Their mission was not to fight, it was to build. Over the course of the war, 64 bottling plants were erected in war zones across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. They were compact units designed to purify any available water source using portable filtration and field chlorination, and to produce bottles using a stripped-down version of the standard industrial line. The American Army provided the logistics, the taxpayer covered the transport, and Coca-Cola built permanent assets in new markets. When the war ended, the 64 plants didn't come home. They were sold or transferred to local partners, who signed franchise contracts with Atlanta. The company had used the military infrastructure of the largest conflict in history to build a global production network without spending its own capital on construction. And 5 billion bottles distributed to American soldiers had created a base of conditioned consumers who carried the habit home and left the machinery installed in every country where they had fought. That was the most efficient corporate geographic expansion move of the 20th century. And it was financed by the government. In the decades that followed, the company would face a crisis that came not from competitors or regulators. It came from the volatility of an agricultural ingredient. Cane sugar was the caloric engine of the formula, and the sugar market was a trap. Climate instability, import quotas, price wars, political instability in Caribbean producer countries. With every sugar market crisis, the company's profit margin swung unpredictably. In the late 1970s, the solution was a quiet chemical shift the company never announced to the public: the replacement of cane sugar with high-fructose corn syrup. The syrup came from American corn, subsidized, abundant, stable, and far cheaper. It integrated Coca-Cola into the agro-industrial complex of the American Midwest, making the company immune to Caribbean market fluctuations. The technical challenge was keeping the taste identical. Corn syrup has a different viscosity and sweetness curve than cane sugar. Engineers in Atlanta spent years recalibrating the formula's proportions, adjusting concentrations of phosphoric acid and carbon dioxide to compensate for the difference. Every bottling plant in the world had to be audited and reconfigured. The transition was invisible to the American consumer, and that was precisely the objective. With the switch to liquid syrup, the plants eliminated entire silos of granulated sugar storage and the dissolving tanks that turned crystals into liquid. The process became liquid in, liquid out, controlled by high-precision flow meters. Production speed increased by approximately 20%. The only failure the company hadn't calculated came from within. In 1983, Coca-Cola executives secretly approved Project Kansas, a radical reformulation of the classic formula to compete with Pepsi, which had been gaining ground in blind taste tests. 200,000 consumer taste tests confirmed that the new formula was preferred over both Pepsi and original Coke. The company was convinced. On April 23, 1985, Coca-Cola launched New Coke and discontinued the classic formula. What the 200,000 tests had failed to measure was what the drink represented beyond taste, identity, memory, belonging. New Coke ads at the Houston Astrodome were booed. Bottles of the old formula were stockpiled and resold at black market prices. In Seattle, cans of New Coke were publicly dumped into storm drains. After 77 days, the company reversed course and relaunched the original formula as Coca-Cola Classic. It lost millions in research and advertising. It gained triple that in free press coverage. And the lesson was recorded. There was something in the formula that was irrationally untouchable. That irrationality was the company's most valuable asset. It was worth more than any factory. The Coca-Cola of 2024 is not a beverage manufacturer. It is an infrastructure holder. The formula is kept in a high-security vault in Atlanta. The company owns more than 500 brands in over 200 countries. It employs 79,000 people. It brings in $46 billion a year in revenue, and it has paid dividends continuously since 1920, increasing the value of those dividends for 60 consecutive years. What John Pemberton created in 1886 was a drug to treat his own addiction. What Asa Candler bought for $2,300 was a system for delivering chemical stimulation with industrial consistency to anyone on the planet. What Robert Woodruff turned it into during World War II was a market colonization operation financed by public money. Each generation of executives received a machine and left it larger than they found it. Not because they were geniuses, because they had discovered what no government or army had managed to codify as efficiently: the way to turn a biological reflex, the drive for stimulation, into a repeatable, predictable, globally scalable transaction. The morphine addict who mixed coca leaves in a copper kettle in Atlanta never imagined what he was creating. That's what makes the story even more disturbing. Every system of power at this scale begins as a solution to a small problem. The problem was one man's addiction. The solution became the addiction of a planet. If you want to keep understanding how these mechanisms work, how private companies build power before governments even notice, subscribe to the channel. Each episode is a piece of the same puzzle. Hit like if this story changed the way you'll look at that bottle. And tell me in the comments, which company today do you think is building the same kind of invisible infrastructure?